Welcome. We're going to start by doing some quick introductions, and then Miriam, I'd love to hear from you first. But very briefly, Miriam, would you like to give an introduction of who you are and what you're doing in the world?
My name is Miriam Diamond. I'm a professor in the Department of Earth Sciences, the School of the Environment. I'm very much involved in international chemicals management now, after having been involved in chemicals management from the city to the province to the national level, now international. But what my research actually has been going into are toxic chemicals. We've been looking in particular at products and what toxic chemicals are in products. And we're looking at that because we're concerned about exposures to the ecosystem and exposures to humans, including vulnerable populations. So I think I'm going to pass the mic before I say too much, because you know professors, they just keep going.
Well, we are at an academic institution, so perhaps that's acceptable. Greetings, everybody. Such a pleasure to see so many people here. My name is Anna-Liza Badaloo. My pronouns are she, her. And I do a few things. I'm an environmental justice storyteller. Why storytelling? Well, when it comes to environmental justice, when it comes to climate justice, when it comes to indigenous environmental justice, stories are where it's at. And data, of course, has a very strong role to play, but so does storytelling. So I do some work in the writing and journalism fields that way. I also am an associate with the Sustainability Network, working on bringing these perspectives to environmental nonprofit organizations. And I also do have a consulting practice where I focus on organizational justice. And on to you.
Hi everyone, my name's Dayna Scott. I teach at York, cross-appointed between Osgoode Law School and the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. My research has focused on environmental justice in terms of the way that environmental law distributes unequal burdens related to pollution and contamination. And I focused particularly on air pollution, gender and environmental health, and more recently on mining for critical minerals. So happy to be here and nice to see, so many people, it's amazing.
Hi everyone, hoping this goes a bit smoother than my lovely appearance up here. My name is Kanisha. I'm a law reform specialist with the Women's Healthy Environments Network. I've been a part of WEN on and off for a few years now. My background is in environmental science, and I have a law degree with specializations in environmental law and Aboriginal and Indigenous law. I'm coming to the table with a little bit of experience working on law and policy reform issues, specifically under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is the law that mostly regulates toxic substances in Canada. And at WEN, we come at these issues through an intersectional feminist lens that considers how not only sex and gender, but other identity factors such as race and such as age will impact how we experience environmental risk in Canada.
Miriam, we're going to chat with you first. Could you tell us a bit about the what, where, and when of toxic exposure in our everyday lives, and how these exposures affect us and our planet?
Where's the clock? Because I need to be reined in on this.
We'll give you a nod.
Okay, what's everybody really interested in? Do you want to just comment on what you're particularly interested in when it comes to chemical exposures? Anybody want to say something from the audience? Sure.
Measurability by the average person in society.
Okay. And
environmental inequities, environmental racism.
Okay. Any other questions or interests or comments?
Miriam, I'm interested in some of the most striking findings that you've had, like things that really surprised you as well.
Okay, so that's what was really surprising. So I'll just say that, first of all, it's inevitable that all of us are exposed to chemicals. It's an absolute inevitability. I mean, just as you are exposed to vitamins through your diet, it's inevitable that we're exposed to everything, to synthetic chemicals. So consider the seats that you're sitting on right now, which have a polyurethane foam cushion on them. And to that polyurethane foam cushion are added flame retardants to actually, this is its whole political story, but ostensibly to retard flammability. It's inevitable that the chemical that's added to the seat that you're sitting on, that a very small fraction of that is going to get into you. It's inevitable because the chemicals are added to that material to produce a function. The chemicals escape and they get into us. What gets into us much more rapidly are chemicals that we would apply to ourselves, such as a biocide that is necessarily going to be put in toothpaste, in hand cream, or in shampoos. And I say that necessarily because one of the great sources of fatalities in the previous centuries was death by infection and by bacteria. So we just have to think a little bit about how we got there. So we're inevitably exposed to materials and to chemicals that are added to achieve functions in building materials, in our personal care products, and in our clothing. So those are the three that I've looked at most in greatest depth. So you wanted to know what was most surprising.
Yeah, I mean, I read a number of articles where you have some interesting findings that can be striking to me, but given how much you know, I'm wondering,
Yeah. And that's hard to sift through all the different results that we've got, but I'll give you a smorgasbord of some of the more interesting and disturbing findings that we've had. So one finding that's very upsetting, I mean, all the findings are upsetting to me, of course. And what I'm talking about are exposures now and not health effects. I don't look at health effects. Our research feeds into the people that look at health effects through, say, epidemiological studies. So one thing that's very disturbing to me is we did a series of studies on social housing. We were looking at plasticizers, flame retardants, and most recently pesticides in social housing. And we were very distressed to see that we found 2 to 18 times higher levels of plasticizers and flame retardants. I don't remember, I'm very poor on remembering numbers. I did remember that number. But the number of chemicals that we looked at, and they were uniformly higher. We don't really understand all the reasons. Some of them are because of cheaper building materials like vinyl flooring that has plasticizers added to it that will necessarily escape over time. We don't really understand why the flame retardants are higher, but the point is that they were higher. And it's inevitable then that the people living in those social housing units will have higher exposures than the people whose homes we measured, I think it was including mine, of higher socioeconomic status. Now what I can also comment on is that some of these chemicals, for example, another study we did, one of the plasticizers that we found, particularly in vinyl flooring, was related to the onset of early childhood asthma. So there is a real effect of the individuals experiencing higher exposures. There can be a real effect. These are probabilities, but there can be a real effect. What we're doing right now, so we've moved on from, and pesticides, we couldn't compare the pesticides we found in social housing with non-social housing because there are no Canadian data. But yeah, nice. But we found 30% detection frequencies of DDT. DDT was banned in 1984. We found, similarly, we found detection frequencies of other long-banned chemicals. We found detection of chemicals that shouldn't be used in indoor settings. They're not authorized for use in indoor settings, but they're used because they are, for example, biocides in gyprock. What's the other name? Wallboard. Drywall, thank you. I keep forgetting that, drywall. Or a biocide that's added to carpets. So we found those chemicals, and why would we expect higher levels of pesticides in social housing? Because of poor upkeep, because of very poor maintenance, because there are outbreaks of bed bugs, there are outbreaks of vermin. That's why pesticides are used, but they're used in higher frequency because of poor maintenance, poor upkeep. There are reasons behind it, and there are some alternatives. We found, we've been looking a lot at the forever chemicals, PFAS. We've looked at them in kids' products, in cosmetics. We're now looking at them in building products, and food packaging. Oh, we were really annoyed to find about half, the highest levels were in the compostable fiber bowls. So how many of you have used one of those compostable fiber bowls? Okay, so those are, you have to rein me in on time, right? Because I could just keep going. So one of the reasons why they're on the market more is because of the legislation to restrict single-use plastics. We won't go into the current court case. But, so you do want to see more fiber bowls. The good news is they weren't in half. That means there are alternatives. The bad news is you don't know which half. And they do migrate. They do migrate out. We were really annoyed. No, we were angry to see PFAS in kids' uniforms. I mean, I get it that some people might want to Scotch guard the couch, but you don't want to Scotch guard your kids. And you know that when they're added to clothing, they're going to get into the kid. I could talk for a lot longer on that. I mean, there are other examples of really gratuitous uses of PFAS, such as in menstrual products and diapers. Am I up? Is my time up? I could get, okay, cosmetics, okay. So we found low levels, but we found some had appreciable levels of PFAS, but you don't know because it's not labeled. So the labeling is such that they're incidental compounds that don't have to be part on the label. So we couldn't actually even figure out where the PFAS was. They're added to intermediate products. So supply chains are really complicated, and somebody in the supply chain is adding the PFAS to, for example, artificial mica, which is used to give that nice shiny look on foundations. I am not a cosmetic specialist, but anyways. Why is the PFAS used? To improve spreadability. It's like the same reason why it's used in wall paints. Oh, I could talk about that too, but anyways. So, I mean, it's like painting your face, painting your lips. And my colleague said, do you know that a woman can, no, just a person who uses lipstick can ingest 7 pounds a year? Oh my God, that's a lot. Okay, anyways, so the PFAS has been added to products, particularly those that are marketed as waterproof, put them on now, last for 24 hours. Who wants makeup on for 24 hours? Put it on, leave it, it'll stay there. So you can try to avoid PFAS in your makeup by avoiding that kind of marketing, also in your clothing. Yes, okay, here's my last example. Do you remember the thing about, well, some of you will remember, the older, paints. So the first set of paints, they just stank because they were oil-based, and they were really annoying. And yeah, they're bad for you because of the solvents that are used to solubilize the dyes to allow you to apply the paint. But that's what paint is, like you have to have some solvent. So then the industry had water-based paints, and then they had low VOC paints. VOC stands for volatile organic compounds. It's like the same stuff, that you smell in a marker. Xylene, toluene, yeah. You shouldn't be smelling your markers, by the way. By the way, crayons. Crayons don't dry out. Much better than markers. Anyways, I digress. So, PFAS has been added to low VOC paints. Why? Because you don't smell it. The VOC you smell, and as a consumer you go, I don't want that. The PFAS, the forever chemicals, you don't smell. It just effectively gets into your body, gets into the water, and stays there forever. And on that note, lovely. Great. Anytime.
Fabulous. I've learned more. Can you speak really quickly to, there's lots of misinformation out there around the idea of a product being on a shelf and it being safe for use. Why are products on the shelf that are not safe for use, or that are health hazards, or that contain environmental contaminants? Can you explain how chemicals are tested and why it's not the case that there are safe products on the shelf? I know that's a loaded question. Do you have 5 minutes?
Yeah. So it's interesting that I'm going to start here by saying that some chemicals are not, have been restricted from use. For example, Canada has a cosmetics hot list. And some of the plasticizers that we looked at, we went into nail salons, for example. And yeah, we didn't find it. And we were very pleased. It's a restricted list. There isn't necessarily follow-up testing for example, for the cosmetics hot list. Or even, say, for pesticides that are registered for use in agricultural settings, but not for indoor settings. There has to be not just regulations, and this is, I'm not going to go into Dayna's territory, don't worry, Dayna. There has to be compliance monitoring. But it's simply too complicated, too expensive, to undertake widespread monitoring. And that's why years ago, wasn't it lead in the Thomas the Tank Engine that was found? And routinely somebody, every couple of years, somebody goes and measures mercury in tuna. It's going to be like a researcher's lab, and we'll find elevated levels of mercury in tuna. And why? Because the Canadian Food Inspection Agency does have a roster of foods that they test for, but it can't be everywhere every time. It's just not feasible to be testing all products. Now, there are products that are particularly egregious. And I don't really understand, and maybe somebody else could explain to me. But for example, hair dyes are really toxic. And women, people who work in hair salons will have a higher frequency of cancer, in part because of the hair dyes that we use. And that's consumer driven. It's consumer driven, but we don't have enough regulation on that. And there isn't enough pressure on that. The other one that's, I think, particularly egregious are products for women of color, like hair straightener and skin lightener, some of which contain mercury. Now, here's one of the issues. If an importer imports at a low level, they may not meet the threshold for testing. Some people bring in products from other countries that are not tested. And then some products just escape testing, and often because they're, and that's just the way it is. And that's a particularly egregious class of products. Products for women of color, for hair, and for skin lightening. There's also, and I don't want to get too technical into this, but there is what's called a de minimis level. That's like a minimum allowable level. For toxicologists, that's a fairly high, I would find that to be a high level, but industry pushes back and says that's what we can comply with. So I want to I want to be very clear about the level of industry lobbying that goes on. I want to be very clear about that. When we have consultations, for example, through the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, through the Chemical Management Plan, those of us are very polite and we sit around the table and we discuss. And we didn't even know that there was a backdoor that industry was going through to be lobbying. I want to tell you that right now, last week, Indiana, or was it this week? No, I think it was last week. The Indiana legislature has decided to have first reading, I don't know if they have first or second readings, but anyways, it's being passed through the legislature to redefine the chemicals that are classified as PFAS. Now, what this means is, sorry, I think I might have gotten into too heavy, anyways. Chemists have a definition of what's PFAS. It's comprehensive. Canada's looking into restrictions on PFAS. It's talking about using a class approach and would adopt that comprehensive definition. States of California, Maine, Washington, other Democratic states have passed legislation to restrict the use of PFAS in cosmetics, in textiles, and in a few other products, food packaging. Now, what the American Chemistry Council, the industry lobby group, is doing, is now, I think, going to be targeting Republican-dominated legislatures to push in legislation that redefines what is classed as PFAS, so that should legislation try to be passed in those legislatures, it won't affect them. It won't affect the paint, it won't affect the cosmetics. So that's an example of how products, that's a really sort of all over the place description of how chemicals and products are on the shelf.
You got some good bits. Thank you, Miriam, for that.
I just wanted to hot off the shelf because this is Indiana.
We got right into it.
Yeah, maybe too much. All right.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Can I just say one other thing?
Yes.
I hate to do this. I hate to do this. This is really embarrassing for Indiana, but I just found out also. Indiana redefined pi. You know pi, the letter pi, which is the mathematical 3.14? Redefined it as 3 in the late 1800s.
That will be all. Thank you for coming. Anna-Liza, I would love to hear from you. Could you please speak to how exposures affect some people more than others? And what are the disparities and injustices at play there? And are those with intersecting identity factors more at risk of harm?
Well, the answer to that last question is yes, for sure. Presentation over. That's all we really need to talk about. Thank you. I'm really, what's up in Indiana? I'm kind of wondering now. First to the question that you asked Miriam, because I think it's an important one. How are we exposed? How is everybody exposed to these things? So there's an organization I'd like to mention that I work with. They're called the Enrich Project. I believe they have a booth here today, in fact. Recently, it was last year, I worked on this project with them, and it was called the Environmental Injustice of Beauty Campaign. Strongly suggest hop on the Enrich Project Instagram. It's all there. We did like a whole social media campaign. And we talked about quite a few things regarding the personal care product angle in particular. And even if we think outside of personal care products, we did this little experiment with ourselves where we said, what if we were to think about our average day, just basically from when we get up in the morning, going through our day, to when we go to bed at night, all the things that we use. Boy, it's a lot of things. So as you're listening to this presentation, feel free, just in your own minds, to do your own version of that. But you're gonna get up, you're gonna do your morning routine, maybe there's brushing teeth, maybe there's showering, maybe there's shampooing of hair. As Miriam mentioned, we're sitting on being surrounded by all kinds of things. All day we're wearing all kinds of things. We're using plastics and food containers all day. God knows on the U of T campus, right? Students be hungry. And, you be needing the quick food, right? Even the compostable bowls, as we heard, not as innocent as we think they are. So when you really take it from that perspective, it really is everywhere. And it's not just one area of life, it actually is every single area of life. And that is why, you quite rightly say, we can't avoid it 100%, right? So don't make that your goal, because you will not succeed. It's just not reasonable. What you want to do is have a least toxic approach. So that's everybody, right? Just everybody in the world. Now, what about for people that are from, such as myself, such as many of us here, from equity-deserving communities? What about people that are racialized? What about people that are Indigenous? Well, what I just said applies, of course, to everybody on this planet at all times. However, we do see what we call disproportionate impacts, such as when we look at where major industry, such as mining, such as pulp and paper mills, such as various resource extraction industries are cited. Are they cited in largely white communities? I don't think so. Now, where they are cited are areas where there tend to be large populations of racialized people, particularly of Indigenous people. And we know that this is not coincidence. Industry does this on purpose. So to your point about the type of things that industry is hiding in terms of things like labeling, well, this is a big thing that they're hiding. Because it could be one of two things. Maybe populations, like people are already living there and there's open space that's not being used with people there that don't really matter anyway, that don't really have political clout, shall we say, that do not have a certain income, that do not have a certain standing in life, shall we say. Well, these people don't really matter, right, when it comes to industry, if any of us matter, to be honest with you, when it comes to industry. And these are cited there, and when they're cited there, that just opens the door for all kinds of things. There's a heck of a lot of research out there about asthma, particularly in Black communities, might I add, the disproportionate burden of asthma when you're living close to these areas, to these factories, to these resource extraction sites. So there's a lot of research out there about that I encourage you to look at. I'm sure we'll be talking about some of that today. But when it comes to the personal care products, that's a really interesting one because where the disproportionate impact is there, it's not always what people think. So an argument that I hear a lot, Miriam, you quite rightly mentioned the extreme toxicity of things like black hair products that typically are very aggressively marketed to Black women. We also have skin lightening creams in my community, the Indo-Caribbean community, the South Asian community. Boy, that's big. And these skin lightening creams are no joke. There's bleach, there's all kinds of stuff in there. And there's also hair lightening creams as well for the same purpose. So sometimes I hear the argument, well, Anna-Liza, just because these products are out there, no one's holding a gun to someone's head and forcing them to buy them. Aren't they, though, is the question. Because what does colonialism teach us, right? It teaches us that we, as non-white people, are somehow dirty, right? It teaches us that we, as non-white people, are somehow having to go above and beyond in terms of cleanliness of our homes, of our bodies, and also in terms of how we present ourselves. So here is why you hear lightening so much, right? You talked about foundations. I mean, good heavens, when I think about the magazines I was looking at as a young girl growing up, you have, an ad for a foundation or something and they have the different shades. Well, trust me, I'm not all that dark, really. And they couldn't even approach the shades I was looking at. I'd be all up in the Shoppers Drug Mart, spending like as long as I possibly could, vaguely looking for a shade that would even approximate, which I did not find, by the way, until maybe a couple of decades ago. So we need to remember that it's not always a choice, because what we're given the choice of is, are we going to comply with white supremacist culture and colonial standards of beauty, or aren't we? And this isn't just an academic question or like sort of frivolous appearance about how we look. This really affects things like job opportunities, right? We've heard a lot about, let's say, with Black women and men, but I've heard more research about Black women, which is why I say women, in terms of what that means in the workplace. In the States, they have an act called the Crown Act, which actually protects, or supposedly anyway, protects people from, experiencing some of these impacts in the workplace. And they partnered with Dove, but Dove, it's exactly who you think it is, to do this study that looked at the fact, and it had some really interesting conclusions. All throughout the workplace, Black women are afraid of, from the very moment of even what their presence is online. Right? Women are using these products to straighten their hair to, approximate whiteness, shall we say, not because people necessarily want you, because it's maybe how you get a job, and it's maybe how you keep a job. And we hear all these stories about Black individuals being literally sent home, like as if we're in school or something, right? Because of their hair. So we just need to remember that it's all around us, point number one, and then secondly, in terms of the products that we supposedly choose to purchase, we really need to think about how much of a choice it is, and we really need to think about what 500 plus years of colonization in this country and others has done along those lines. I'll leave it there for now.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to chat with Kanisha for a moment. Kanisha, I'm going to go on to your second question because I think we got a good picture. Could you chat to us about what gender-based analysis plus is and how it could be used to better protect vulnerable populations, these populations that Anna-Liza was speaking about?
Yeah, so Gender-Based Analysis Plus is essentially an analytical tool where the federal government is supposed to assess how their government initiatives may impact people differently because of their identity factors. So identity factors can include sex, gender, race, socioeconomic status, language, ability, culture, and many more. And GBA Plus also considers the intersection of these various identity factors and how that can compound your vulnerability in society. So Gender-Based Analysis Plus, it's been around for a really long time. It's a legal requirement for the federal government to conduct it on every piece of legislation, every policy, every initiative. But a lot of reports from the auditor who monitors the federal government's activities will show that it's almost never been done, and could definitely never been done to the degree that it should be being done. So in the context of toxics, this analysis is required because the plus in Gender-Based Analysis Plus means that it goes beyond the consideration of just sex and gender to now consider all of the other factors that can make someone vulnerable. So essentially, GBA Plus provides an intersectional diversity analysis that basically considers how everyone in society will experience something differently based on how and where they exist in society. And so an example for this for under toxics would be talcum powder. So that's one of my favorite examples because it really exemplifies how our approach to toxic substances management does not protect women and does not protect vulnerable populations. So the assumption under how we assess toxic substances is that everyone is exposed to the same amount, which is not true. So in the context of talc, we have talcum powder, which is used on babies, which is also used on women, and specifically in their genital region. And if you look at all of the branding and the marketing from when talc became a product, the marketing is using it to be fresh and clean so that you're desirable to your male partner. It's put on you that if you don't use this, there's something gross about you, and so you need to be using this product. And these campaigns go so far back that you're like, oh, maybe it's not like that anymore, but it is. So if you think about who is vulnerable to talc exposure specifically, there's women or women identifying people. And then there's also, you look at it from the sex component, where physiologically people with ovaries are at a greater risk of harm from talc because there is a link between talc use in the genital region and ovarian cancer. But this, you will never find that hazard on a cautionary statement on a product. So for example, in Canada, you can still buy hair removal products like Veet hair removal cream that is marketed to be used by young women. So if you take a 13-year-old who is in high school and is like going through puberty and going through all of those hormonal changes where you're wanting to comply with social pressures and you're maybe not in a position to be like, hey, actually I don't want to remove hair, but you're gonna comply with what society is expecting you to do, you go to Shoppers Drug Mart, you find this product on the shelf, you assume that because it's there, it's safe for consumption. You look, even if you do, which most people don't, I know I don't read all of the label, but you turn it around and you see nothing about the link between using this product and ovarian cancer, and you take it home and you use it. And this is despite the fact that Health Canada, in its assessment of talc, clearly talks about the link between using it in your genital region and getting ovarian cancer. But then when they develop risk mitigation measures, which would include hazard labeling or some sort of public education around this issue, they don't include that. So now, even now, talc-containing products will have cautionary statements to avoid inhalation, specifically for kids and infants, but there is nothing about it for women, which is so problematic on so many other levels, and just shows how ingrained it is for like our legislation to exclude so many areas of society. And then on top of being a woman, you can compound all of these other identity factors. So for example, you have the Fair and Lovely, the skin lightening cream. So I grew up in a culture where being fair is something that you should strive for. So I grew up with relatives telling me to stay out of the sun, not because of cancer risk, but because I don't want to get too dark. And then you have people coming up to you and saying, oh my God, it's so great. Look how fair you are. That's amazing. And it's like, that's obviously not the compliment that you think it is. It's like so awful. But then the way that these products are marketed, in India, there is like a dishwashing liquid made by Fair and Lovely. So there's so many layers in that. They're like, while you're doing your gendered norm duty of washing dishes in your home, now you have this added benefit of also becoming more desirable by lightening your skin. So yeah, basically that is the considerations that gender-based analysis plus would include if it was applied correctly, but unfortunately we are not at that point.
Thank you very much. Dayna, I'd love to chat with you. Considering what we've learned about exposures so far, what does this mean for us in terms of systemic changes? What needs to happen in law and policy in order to better protect the health of all people and the planet?
Okay, thank you. Thanks to everybody for being here, and I'm already learning so much that I don't want to know. Okay, so I don't have the full answer to that, obviously. I think, the main thing is we all have to pay attention to what we can collectively struggle for in terms of like real meaningful change, including legislative change. And in my view, that's a much more productive direction to direct our energies towards than trying to figure out all the details of how we can kind of consume our way out of this problem. So in terms of legislative change, over the past few years, we actually have seen a little bit of movement. So there has been amendments to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. The actual legislation was called the Strengthening Environmental Protection for a Healthier Canada Act. It received royal assent last year, and it basically amends what we call the CEPA, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. That piece of legislation was, more than 20 years old. It was hopelessly out of date. It had been subject to repeated attempts at amendments over many years that had gone to committee. There had been many recommendations, as Miriam said. Most of them were either pushed back by industry, died on the order paper, a number of different things happened. But we did finally get amendments to the CEPA this past year, and that is positive. There's lots in there to be optimistic about. We have, for example, the first time in Canadian statute law, the right to a healthy environment in Canada. So those words are now written there on the books, and we can try to make the government make them meaningful. So they've given themselves a 2-year implementation period to develop a framework to try to figure out how implementing the right to a healthy environment will work. They have said a couple of principles are important in that. Environmental justice principles, as we've heard about, like trying to get at those disparities that are based on privilege. There's a non-regression principle, which is an attempt to put into legislation the idea that we can make environmental laws stronger but not weaker. There is an intergenerational equity component, which I think is becoming really obvious to most of us about how much of a burden we are kind of kicking down the road as we continue not just on climate change but certainly on toxics as well. There were a few improvements, I think, to the CEPA in relation to assessing the real world exposures, like the cumulative exposures to the many different toxics at once. And Miriam talked a little bit about this. Some progress towards doing risk assessments that can be based on a whole group or class of substances rather than putting in so much energy to go substance by substance, like one toxic at a time. And of course, industry responding, we call it the whack-a-mole, right? Like you finally legislatively get one knocked down and they come right away with an alternative that's just as toxic. The key weaknesses of the SEPA remain, right? And that is that it really does nothing by itself to solve the kinds of environmental justice problems that we've heard about. So that means there's major air pollution burdens, water pollution burdens, drinking water disparities. Those things remain, and they really can't be tackled by SEPA. And that is because it does not put in place what we call binding ambient standards, right? So there are no sort of minimum standards that we have in place across Canada for any of those things. So this brings me to the second piece of optimism on the legislative front, and that is the Bill C-226, which is known as the Environmental Racism Bill. The long title, the National Strategy Respecting Environmental Racism and Environmental Justice Act, has made it through the House of Commons and is currently before committee in the Senate. I would applaud Lenore Zan and Dr. Ingrid Waldron of Enrich and others for putting that agenda out into the open. Started in Nova Scotia. It came to the federal parliament with the Green Party. It's a very short 5-section bill. You could all look at it when you go home. You could read it in like 5 minutes, less maybe. What it requires basically is the Minister of Environment to produce and table a strategy on environmental racism. It says in section 3 that the strategy must include, quote, measures that can be taken to advance environmental justice and assess, prevent, and address environmental racism, and that may include possible amendments to federal laws, policies, and programs. So what I want to say is it's very important for us to support and defend this bill. It has been subject to critique from the Conservative parties in general. Those are that it should not include the word racism at all because that makes Canada look like racists, and really everyone suffers from environmental problems. I think we've already knocked that one down on this panel. I'm not going to go there. The second criticism, it will impact resource project approvals. Always a concern, of course, in federal politics. It's possible it will. I'm going to circle back on that. The thing I wanted to point out, it was 1994, so now 30 years ago in the US, they passed an executive order on environmental justice that was called Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations. And it was basically a rule that required the EPA to make environmental justice considerations part of its permitting processes, okay? I think we do very well to remember the critiques of that order. One was that it lacked requirements that environmental justice plays a determining factor in siting, rulemaking, and permitting decisions. Instead, what the order did was directed agencies to adopt an environmental justice strategy and implement it. So what I'm telling you is that 30 years ago in the US, they implemented the kind of rule that we are now fighting to try to get through our federal parliament. It was rescinded by Trump, of course, and it was partially reinstated by Biden. So I'm not trying to say in the US they've solved environmental justice, but I am trying to say we're trying to take a very small baby step, and it's really hard. Why is it so hard? Part of the problem we have in Canada, so if you just think about this again, we're fighting to get a bill that does not even include in it a prohibition on locating polluting facilities in already overburdened communities of color or low-income places. That is not what's in the bill. That is what we need, right? That's not what's in the bill. It's not even close to being on the table. And part of the reason our long-standing constitutional structures people will know about, permitting, of course, the kind of facility siting decisions that we've heard about are in the hands of the provinces, right? So we have now a bill in front of the federal parliament that is going to try to tackle environmental racism that will never be able to impact permitting or facility siting decisions. So those things we know about. in near Aamjiwnaang First Nation in Sarnia, Ontario, where there's 62 high polluting petrochemical facilities spewing out air pollutants at sometimes 100 times the ambient health-based standard that applies, that is not going to be touched by this bill. Okay? In places like Grassy Narrows where the mercury contamination is out of control. All of those things carry on even if we get this bill. Okay, so that is a place we need to struggle forward. These permitting decisions that lie currently with the provinces are going to be heavily defended, but we need to continue to chip away at them. One place there's a little bit of optimism, I would say there is, we're starting to see more and more momentum for, in particular, Indigenous territories, for jurisdiction to be shared, or jurisdiction to be ideally restored and returned to Indigenous people of those territories. That would include, ideally, control over permitting. And in Ontario, mineral staking is my biggest complaint at the moment. You guys probably want me to stop. Those are the two for now, the pieces of legislation that are there have been optimistic progress over the past little while, but we really need to keep fighting collectively to get what we need to be in those bills.
Thank you, Dayna. Before we pivot into some action-based questions, Dayna, would you mind explaining briefly for us what the difference is between precautionary consumption and corporeal citizenship?
Sure. Okay, so precautionary consumption, many of you will already know what that is. That's the thing that flies directly into your head when you're reading the newspaper and it says, study comes out that says PFAS is in, children's toys or something, and you think immediately, like, oh my God, I gotta get that out of my kids' toys. Or I've gotta figure out how to not buy the shampoo with that thing in it, or whatever. The problem with precautionary consumption, of course, is it's built on this idea that we can separate ourselves, right? And as Miriam has already explained, everybody here has said, that's just not possible. So the instinct to build a barrier, right, that's going to put pollution on the outside and keep us safe, it's an understandable instinct, it's just not possible. We know that toxics are crossing all those barriers. They're crossing fence lines, right? They're crossing borders. They're crossing our skin. They're crossing placenta. They're getting into your organs. They're doing all of those things. They're moving, right? And so trying to create the barrier is just futile. So if you kind of can give up on that idea of the separation, you're adopting a more of a relational perspective, or like thinking of yourself as part of the environment, part of the ecology, in relation with your world, right? That's what leads to this idea of corporeal citizenship, which is like, I'm a person immersed in a world, right? I have relations to all of those elements of the environment and all of those people and non-human and elements around me. And I have to think about extending my sphere of ethical responsibility outwards, right? Instead of turning inwards, like with precautionary consumption, you're extending yourself outwards and understanding that if you take care of all those things around, you're also taking care of yourself, your family, etc. So some concrete ways of thinking about that. When we are worried about particular chemicals or products, we should also be worried about the workers who have to be in those facilities creating those products. They are also being exposed to those things, right? How about the people who live in the communities that are downwind of that facility, right? All of those folks we're in some kind of relationship with. And I would make the argument, lots of people have made the argument, that's an ethical responsibility. So if we take these more structural kinds of approaches to toxic chemicals, then we're taking care of more than just ourselves and our immediate family, but we're trying to take care of that sort of broader web of people, non-people, everything we're in relationship with.
Beautiful, thank you. It's a good reminder. Keeps our feet on the ground. I have a question for all of you, and you're welcome to pipe up and hand the mic around. And the question is, for our audience, what actions can we take as academics, as public citizens, and as students to be a part of this transition towards a safer, more equitable, and more sustainable future? And how do we take this knowledge and act collectively? So I know you touched on that, being corporeal citizens. How can we be that?
I'll take a crack at that one. That's a big question. So, first of all, Bill C-226. Thank you for mentioning that. Informally dubbed the Environmental Racism Bill. I agree with everything that you said. There's a heck of a lot of things that that bill should be doing that it's not doing. Here's why I do think it's important, though. Just even the term environmental racism, even though, as you mentioned, Conservative Party not down with it, right? There's all kinds of things that they've been doing and speaking up about. But I think that we need to think a little bit about this stuff, right? Like, what is it? Why is it now that this term is only for the first time coming into our language as a country, right? And when it comes into language as a country, it's immediately questioned, right? That's the very first thing that happened. And when it's immediately questioned, and then 2 seconds after that, it's denied, right? What is environmental racism? Why do we need to talk about it? We don't need to talk about it. It doesn't really exist because this is Canada. And one thing I'd like to encourage us all to do as Canadians, in what is colonially called Canada, boy, we're real good at sitting on our high horse and saying, oh, those people in the States, oh, I don't know what's going on there. Well, let's not do that too much because we're geographically not as far away. They are our biggest trading partner. We can't forget that. We have different cultures, shall we say, between our two countries, but it's very important to pay attention to what's happening there, particularly with regards to environmental justice. Also, as you mentioned, you know, in some ways the U.S. is ahead of us. I'm hesitant to use that phrase. I'm not quite sure how to say it, but in some ways, you know the way they're ahead of us is the data collection. We have a real serious problem in this country with not collecting race-based data. And, you know, the question is, if the data isn't there, did it really happen, right? And from a government perspective, from a policy perspective, from a research perspective, the answer is no. You got to prove it, right? Yet we don't have the structures in place in this country largely to allow us to collect that data, never mind to actually use it in either government, academic, private sector circles, never mind actually getting this information out to the communities directly that need it, never mind getting it out to them in a way that is accessible and not in sort of academic speak or government language, right? So there's a lot here. That being said, please take a look for yourselves. You're right, it's the shortest bill I've seen in my life. Like when I first looked at it, I'm flipping through like, where's the rest of it? Like it's just really short. I want to mention one organization. They're called the CCECJ, and then the website is ccecj.ca. Boy, that's a mouthful. Canadian Coalition for Environmental and Climate Justice. And they, I should say we, since I sit on a few committees, were very involved, very involved with Bill C-226. And not too long ago, we had, and in fact, an environmental justice office, which has long existed in the United States, it's actually going to be a thing that's going to happen here. It's actually going to be a thing that's going to happen. ECCC, Environment Canada, is working on this. But I encourage all of you, when you leave here today, see for yourself. Don't take our word for it, right? This is part of what it means to be an active and engaged citizen. Check out Bill C-226. Go to the CCECJ website. There's also groups such as the David Suzuki Foundation, such as Environmental Defense, such as CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. One organization I want to mention too is Prevent Cancer Now. They don't get enough credit, in my opinion. Prevent Cancer Now does an amazing job. One of their scientists there, Dr. Meg Sears, has been like a personal mentor to me in terms of researching these things. And what's great about Prevent Cancer Now is, yes, they have the data and the research, but they know a lot about the lobbying, as you mentioned. And we have no idea. Until you start looking into it, we're really all quite naive. We have a lot of trust, right, in our industries that, you know, when we have a product on the shelf, we think it's safe. We have a lot of trust that when there's legislation out there that is meant to protect us as citizens, well, the question to ask is, who does this legislation protect? It ain't us. It's industry, largely, is who it protects, right, in the private sector. So I encourage you to go ahead and do that research for yourself, and in your personal lives as individuals. I'll tell you a little bit about my journey with this. So, you know, growing up, I always had chemical sensitivities, you know, and I'm still that person. If I smell paint, perfume, varnish, that's it for me. I got a headache, I can't think, I'm getting super irritable, like you don't want to be around me. Trust me, I've been exposed to these chemicals. So how can you actually avoid this? Well, it's very easy when you start doing these things, as you said, to just be like, wow, now that I've learned this stuff, I need to remove everything immediately from every aspect of my life, which isn't true. Here's what I encourage you to do. Start with the place that most resonates with you. Maybe that's your cleaning products at home. Maybe that is your personal care products or your cosmetics. Maybe it is items that you're using for your children or the young folks in your life, right? Elderly people, let's not forget them, right? Also very vulnerable. And you don't have to do it all at once, and you don't have to break the bank, right? Nobody's saying, like, don't be risking not paying next month's rent, right? Because you're trying to detoxify yourself. Just do it gradually, do it at your own pace, do your research. And one thing I remember encountering is that it was super expensive when I first went on this journey myself, because you're out there, a lot of them, by the way, there's a ton now of natural, genuinely natural product companies made in Canada, by the way. Many of them are which now are Indigenous owned, which I strongly support. And I think it's just really a matter of starting with what makes sense to you. Stick within your budget, right? If it gets to a point where you're able to make more money later on, great, you can amp it up then. And to save money to begin with though, start doing it with some friends, right? Let's say you decide to try out some new, I don't know, makeup or hair products. Get a few friends together, because a lot of these companies, they don't have sample sizes like the bigger companies do. So get a few friends together. If somebody buys a product that somebody's not going to use, then let's not waste that money, right? You can pass it on to your friend. So there's lots of ways to do this, but don't pressure yourself, because guess what? A lot of this stuff is impacting your hormones and your endocrine system. Wouldn't that be ironic to like increase your stress and get your endocrine system all messed up because you're trying to avoid endocrine disrupting chemicals, right? So let's not do that to ourselves. I'll leave it there.
Is there anybody else who wants to share?
Mm-hmm. So I agree with that. What a wise panel. I have to say. Great questions. So what we've talked about is both personal agency and collective action. And I think we have to, I just want to reinforce that it's a combination of personal agency, understanding that we all live in a context, because of course you've talked about the pressures on individuals to conform. And it's very hard to exert that personal agency when there are so many strong forces that are trying to convince you otherwise. And yet, that's why you're here, because you do have agency, and that's why you've chosen to be here and to listen. So one issue of personal agency that I keep coming back to is that we're not going to be able to sufficiently regulate ourselves out of this issue, out of this mess. It's a matter of, I'm not talking about you personally, but in general, a society of overconsumption. It's a matter of reducing your expectations. We cannot live in a safe world without toxic chemicals at current levels of consumption of just about everything. I'm going to talk very briefly about two examples which we've been looking into. One is fast fashion, which is just an unbelievably voracious consumption of materials and resources that put at peril everyone from those producing those fashions in low-income countries to where it goes back to be disposed of in low-income countries, and especially because they don't last any length of time. I have fewer items of clothing that I wear for a long time. I don't have expectations of switching them out quickly. There are huge implications for trying to maintain, for trying to conform with those ideas, and there is tremendous pressure. Pushback. Second way is with your electronics appetite. Electronics have a huge appetite for resources, and Dayna talked about critical minerals that are used in every one of your devices. Something simple to do, and it's not so simple, but just keep your electronics for longer. Just simply keeping stuff out of e-waste. And e-waste is anything with a battery or a plug. Has really large implications everywhere, from resource extraction of the cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo and rare earth elements from Indonesia and China to their disposal, once again, in low-income countries. That's where we have agency. And again, as Dayna and everybody talked about, it's collective action to make sure that we are out there and voting for responsible politicians, not responsible politicians who listen to us. It's not just voting, but it's also being very active. It doesn't matter how you're active, by being a member of one of the many organizations that you mentioned. It doesn't matter how, it just matters what you do and that you're active. Politicians respond to what the public is listening to. The squeaky wheel does get the grease. We have to be the squeaky wheels. I think I'll end there.
You just continue.
Kanisha or Dayna, do you have anything to add, or are you? Yeah?
Yeah, just going to reiterate everything. In terms of collective action, I do think, it's a strategic move for the government to individualize the responsibility of what toxics we are exposed to. And precautionary consumption is a privilege. It's really a privilege to be able to buy a clean product, and to be able to make a switch from the products that you're using. And I think that really highlights for me the importance of the collective action component of this, because we really need systemic changes. And so, as mentioned, I really do think that, finding an issue that you are especially passionate about, joining some sort of organization, signing some petitions, engaging with your MPs, and voting. You're never gonna find a politician who you're like, I strongly support every single thing that you're doing. And there are way too many people out there being like, I'm just not gonna vote because I don't like their platforms. And that is a huge abuse of the privilege that we have to use our power to vote. And so, yeah, I will leave it there.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for so eloquently leading us through this journey of awareness and agency and collective action.